"Don't move, the billionaire," gasped, his grip surprisingly strong for a man pinned under the weight of his own collapsing mansion. The storm howled outside, but in the dusty darkness, the only sound was his ragged breathing. His eyes weren't on her face, but on the cheap, broken watch strapped to Maya's wrist. His voice dropped to a choked whisper, full of something she couldn't name. Pain, regret, recognition. That watch, he rasped, his gaze locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "I gave it to your mother, the night I told her to run and never look back. If this story has already grabbed you, make sure you subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss what happens next." The catered affair on Julian Davenport's private island was less a party and more a display of power. It was a world Maya at 19 had only ever seen in movies. Here laughter was a little too loud, the clinking of champagne flutes a little too constant, and money was an invisible gas that everyone but her seemed to breathe. Dressed in a crisp black and white server's uniform that felt more like a costume, she moved through the glittering crowd with practiced invisibility, her mind a million miles away on her grandmother's mounting medical bills. This job for this one night was a necessary evil. The other staff spoke of Julian Davenport in hushed, fearful tones. They said he was a ghost in his own home, a ruthless tech magnate who moved with a chilling silence. "He's in a foul mood tonight," a fellow server whispered to her by the kitchens. "Word is his new AI protocol just made 2,000 employees redundant this morning." He didn't even flinch. The news sent a small, cold stone sinking in Maya's stomach. It made the man and the world he represented feel even more alien. Later, while navigating a narrow corridor crowded with guests, it happened. A jostle from behind, a loss of balance, and her tray of crystal glasses tilted, then crashed to the marble floor with a sound that seemed to shatter the entire evening. The bubble of noise popped, every head turned, and there he was, Julian Davenport. He stood over her, his tall frame casting a long shadow. His face, etched with impatience and disdain, was a mask of cold fury. His mouth opened, no doubt, to deliver the verbal execution she expected, the kind that would end her night and any chance of being hired again. But the words never came. His gaze, sharp as a shard of the broken glass at her feet, fell to her wrist, to the simple, worthless watch she always wore. Its face was cracked, its hands frozen at 3:17, the exact time her adoptive father's heart had stopped beating 3 years ago. For a single breathtaking second, the mask on Julian's face disintegrated. The fury vanished, replaced by a flicker of something raw and unprotected. It was a look of utter shock of a man seeing a ghost in broad daylight. Pain, deep and ancient, swirled in the depths of his cold blue eyes. It was there for only an instant, but it was as real as the broken crystal on the floor. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The mask of indifference slammed back into place, colder than before. "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously low and steady. It wasn't a shout, but a dismissal so absolute it felt 1,000 times worse. He turned and walked away, leaving her kneeling in the sudden silence, the sound of the approaching storm outside suddenly seeming very, very close. Maya stared after him, her heart pounding, not from fear of being fired, but from the terrifying, impossible question: why did the sight of her father's broken watch look like it had just broken Julian Davenport's soul? The shame of the dismissal burned hotter than any physical blow. Maya found refuge in a deserted service corridor, a narrow passage with a single large window overlooking the churning sea. The sky, once a placid twilight blue, was now a bruised and angry purple. Whitecaps frothed on the waves, throwing themselves against the island's rocky shores with a growing violence. The approaching storm was a mirror to the tempest inside her. His look, It wasn't just anger, it was something else, something broken. Her gaze fell to her wrist, to the cause of it all. The watch. Its face was a spiderweb of fine cracks, the hands frozen forever at 17 minutes past 3. It was worthless to anyone else, but to her it was everything. The cold glass of the corridor window pressed against her forehead as memory pulled her back away from the cold marble of the mansion and into the warm, cluttered chaos of her father's workshop. The air then had smelled of sawdust and lemon oil polish. Her father, the only father she had ever known, had hands that were calloused and stained from a lifetime of working with wood, but they were always gentle. He had presented the watch to her on her 16th birthday, placing it in her palm as if it were a rare jewel. "It's not new, Maya, girl," he had said, his voice a low, warm rumble, like sanding a fine piece of oak. "Belonged to a man who ran out of time. But I figured, you and I, we have all the time in the world." She remembered tracing the crack on the glass. "It's broken, Papa." He had smiled, a slow, easy smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "That's the beauty of it. This old thing doesn't care about money or keeping up. It only remembers one moment. You just have to make sure the moments you remember are the good ones." He had tapped the frozen hands. Besides, time can stop. Love doesn't have to. That love was the only inheritance he had left her. It was the foundation of her world, the quiet, steady beat beneath the noise of her life. And tonight, for some inexplicable reason, that simple sacred memory had collided with the cold, hard world of Julian Davenport. How could he have looked at this symbol of her father's love with such recognition? Miles away in his private library on the mansion's top floor, Julian Davenport was not looking at the storm. He stared into a glass of amber whiskey, the ice cubes clinking with the tremor in his hand. The mask of controlled indifference he wore for the world was gone. Here alone, his face was a portrait of self-loathing. With a heavy sigh, he set the glass down and opened a locked drawer in his antique desk. From beneath a stack of stock certificates and corporate reports, he pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was faded at the edges, softened by years of handling. The picture showed a young black woman, her hair a halo of tight curls, her smile so bright it seemed to generate its own light. She was leaning against the railing of a simple apartment balcony, the city lights blurry behind her. Her head was tilted back in laughter, a picture of pure, unguarded joy. He traced the outline of her face with his thumb, his touch impossibly gentle. "Althea," he whispered the name, a ghost on his lips, an ache in his chest. It was her. The same defiant chin, the same laugh in her eyes that he had just seen in the girl downstairs. The girl wearing the watch he had given Althea. The watch he had told her was a promise he had shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. He closed his eyes, but the image of the watch on Maya's wrist was burned onto the back of his eyelids, a relic of his greatest love and his most profound failure, now worn by the daughter he never knew he had. A deafening crack of thunder shook the mansion to its foundations. The lights flickered violently, then died, plunging the library into near total darkness. Outside, the wind didn't just howl anymore, it screamed. The storm of memory had finally met the fury of the present, and the night was far from over. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the opulent great hall in a ghastly, intermittent blue. The darkness that fell between each pulse was absolute, filled only with the shriek of the wind and the first sharp cry of human panic. The illusion of civilization had vanished in an instant. The billionaires and their elegant partners who, moments before, had been discussing art auctions and corporate takeovers were now just frightened animals trapped in a cage of glass and stone. A woman in a diamond necklace was openly sobbing in a corner, while a man who ran a global hedge fund scrambled to get a signal on his useless satellite phone. Their wealth was a foreign currency here. The storm did not care about their stock portfolios or their offshore accounts. It was the great equalizer, and it was angry. While others were frozen in fear, something practical and steady took over in Maya. This wasn't a boardroom crisis. It was a physical one. She saw an elderly woman trembling near a vast window that was beginning to bow inward under the force of the wind. Without a second thought, Maya was at her side. "Ma'am, let's move away from the glass," she said, her voice calm and firm, cutting through the rising hysteria. She guided the woman toward the center of the room, away from the immediate danger. Julian Davenport appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his face grim in the strobing emergency lights. "Arthur, get the storm shutters on the east wing secured. Now," he bellowed, trying to impose order on the chaos. But his voice, which could make markets tremble, was just a man's shout against the roar of the hurricane. The storm was the only authority here. A deafening crack like a gunshot echoed through the hall. One of the massive sea-facing windows didn't just break. It exploded inwards, unleashing a torrent of wind and salt water that ripped through the room. Guests screamed as they were hit with spray and stinging shards of glass. The roar of the storm was inside now, a physical presence tearing at tapestries and sending priceless vases crashing to the floor. Panic became a tidal wave. People were running, slipping on the wet marble, their evening gowns and tailored suits, no protection at all. But above the sound of the wind above the human, screams, a new sound began. It was a low, groaning, deep-throated noise coming from just outside the west wing. A sound of immense strain, of something ancient and massive giving way. It was a sound of splintering of a life, spanning centuries being torn apart. Everyone who heard it froze their eyes, turning in unison toward the source of that terrible final sound. The sound of the giant oak tree, the one that had stood guard over this island for 200 years, finally surrendering to the storm. The sound was not a crash, but a deep, resonant thump that shuddered through the very foundations of the island. It was the sound of a giant falling, a sound of finality. For a moment, an unholy silence fell, broken only by the relentless shriek of the wind. Then the world dissolved into dust and chaos. The ceiling above the great hall groaned, and a fine powder of ancient plaster rained down on the terrified guests. The west wing where the library stood was gone. In its place was a gaping wound of splintered wood, shattered stone, and the immense dark limbs of the fallen oak tree slick with rain. "Is everyone all right, Arthur?" The butler was the first to find his voice, his tone strained but steady, as he moved through the crowd, a small emergency flashlight cutting a path through the haze. He began a quick, frantic head count, his professional composure a thin veneer over raw fear. He pointed his light from one pale face to another. "Mrs. Albright, Mr. Chen Good." "Good." He paused, sweeping the beam across the room again. "Wait," he said, his voice dropping. "Where is Mr. Davenport?" The question hung in the air, thick and heavy as the dust. A wave of murmurs spread through the guests. No one had seen him since the window exploded. Maya's blood ran cold. She remembered his face in the strobing emergency lights, a grim silhouette at the top of the stairs, shouting orders just before the west wing was hit. He had been heading that way. The library, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the noise. He was going to the library. All eyes turned to the gaping hole where the library used to be. It was a tangled mess of destruction, a dark cavern, groaning under the weight of the ancient tree and the relentless storm. "It's suicide to go in there," one of the guests stammered. The whole structure could go at any second. He was right. It was reckless. It was foolish, and Julian Davenport was a cold, cruel man who had looked at her with nothing but contempt. But he was also a human being, trapped and bleeding in the dark. The memory of her own father's gentle hands, of his quiet lessons about decency and doing the right thing, no matter the cost, rose up in her stronger than her fear. Ignoring Arthur's sharp call of her name, Maya turned on her phone's flashlight and moved toward the wreckage. She found a small, jagged opening near the floor, a space where a doorway used to be, now mostly blocked by a fallen tapestry and splintered furniture. It was just big enough to squeeze through. The air inside was thick with the smell of rain, wet earth, and pulverized stone. Every step was a gamble. Glass crunched under her feet. Rain poured through the mangled roof, creating slick, treacherous puddles on the floor. A small beam of light danced over the devastation, priceless books, torn and waterlogged a grand piano, crushed under a ceiling joist, a lifetime of curated wealth reduced to rubble. "Mr. Davenport," she called out, her voice sounding small and thin. Silence. Only the groaning of stressed metal and the drumming of the rain answered. She pushed forward, scrambling over a pile of fallen bookshelves. "Hello, can anyone hear me?" A faint sound, a low groan almost lost in the storm. Her heart leapt. She swept her light across the debris-strewn floor, following the sound. It led her toward the back of what used to be the library, near the reinforced wall, where she had earlier noticed a heavy vault-like door. And then her light found it. A hand. The fingers were pale, twitching weakly, extending from beneath a massive splintered oak beam. Maya scrambled closer, her breath catching in her throat. She aimed her light fully. It was him, Julian Davenport. The titan of industry, the master of this universe, was pinned, half-buried and broken. His face was ghostly pale, a dark gash bleeding freely from his temple. His expensive suit shredded and stained with dirt and blood. He was trapped. He was dying. The world narrowed to the small, dusty pocket of space carved out of the wreckage. The roar of the storm outside faded into a distant hollow sound. Here there was only the unsteady beam of her phone's light, the scent of rain-soaked earth, and the ragged, shallow breathing of the man bleeding out at her feet. Mr. Davenport Maya's voice was steady, a stark contrast to the frantic drumming in her own chest. "Can you hear me? You have to stay awake." She tore a strip from the hem of her uniform blouse and pressed it firmly against the gash on his temple. His skin was cold and clammy, his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. He looked at her, but she wasn't sure he was really seeing her. "Althea," he murmured the name, a broken thing. Maya froze for a heartbeat. It was her mother's name, a name she had only ever heard spoken in the past tense by her grandmother. "No," she said, her voice shaking just once. "It's Maya. I'm here to help you." His gaze drifted from her face, down her arm to her wrist. The weak beam of her flashlight caught the cracked face of her watch. His breathing hitched. The fog in his eyes sharpened into a sudden, terrifying focus. The immense effort it took was visible, but he pushed himself up slightly on one elbow, his eyes locked on the watch. "No," he whispered, a sound of pure disbelief. "It can't be." He reached out his fingers, wrapping around her wrist with a strength that belied his injuries. His touch was cold, his grip desperate. He wasn't holding her. He was anchoring himself to the one thing in the chaos that he recognized. "That watch," he rasped, his voice a dry, rattling whisper. "It was a promise I broke." "It was my father's," Maya said, trying to pull back a cold dread snaking around her heart. "He gave it to me." The word father seemed to break something inside him. His eyes pools of deep blue, and deeper regret met hers. He pulled her closer until her face was just inches from his, until she could feel the faint, whiskey-laced warmth of his breath. The whisper that came next was not meant for the storm or for the wreckage. It was meant only for her, a confession clawed from the depths of a 50-year-old soul. "I gave that to your mother." He choked out each word, a shard of glass. The night I told her to run and never look back. It took 4 of the strongest men on staff to move the heavy oak beam. They carried Julian out of the wreckage like a fallen king, his unconscious form a testament to the storm's impartial fury. In the relative safety of the main drawing room, he was laid upon a damask sofa, his breathing shallow, his face the color of ash. A strange quiet fell over the guests. The raw survival panic had subsided, replaced by a dazed, morbid curiosity as they watched the titan of their world brought so low. Maya did not join them. She sat on the cold bottom step of the grand staircase, away from the huddle of wealth and shock. The world around her had become a muffled, distant hum. Her universe had shrunk to the broken watch clutched in her trembling hand. His words echoed in the silence of her mind, a terrible repeating loop. "I gave that to your mother. The night I told her to disappear forever." It didn't make sense. It couldn't be true. And yet she knew with a bone-deep certainty that it was. The look in his eyes had not been a lie. "You should drink this, miss." Maya looked up. Arthur the old butler was standing before her, holding a steaming cup of tea. His uniform was impeccable, save for a smudge of dust on his lapel. In the midst of the chaos, he moved with an unnerving calm, a steady ship in a turbulent sea. She took the cup, her fingers numb. Arthur's kind, weary eyes glanced down at the watch in her other hand, then back to her face. He saw the shock, the dawning horror, the questions that were too big to be spoken. A look of quiet decision settled over his features. He had kept his master's secrets for 30 years. Tonight the storm had broken, more than just the mansion walls. "Come with me," he said softly. "There is a small study on this floor that was not damaged. It is quiet there." He led her to a small wood-paneled room, lit by a single battery-powered lantern on a desk. The sound of the rain was a gentle drumming against the windows here, a soothing rhythm after the violence of the storm. He gestured for her to sit in a leather armchair. "You have a right to know the rest of the story," Arthur began, his voice even. "Not the version the world knows, but the truth." He stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the dark, wet glass. 30 years ago, Mr. Davenport was not the man you see today. He was brilliant, yes, and ambitious. But there was a light in him then, a passion. He was ruled by his father, a man of immense wealth and antiquated prejudices. Julian was the heir, but he was also a prisoner. It was then Arthur continued, his voice softening, that he met your mother, Althea. He spoke her name with a reverence that made Maya's heart ache. She was a pianist, a genius on a music scholarship the Davenport Foundation sponsored. She was not like the other women in his world. She was fire and sunlight and fearless honesty. They fell in love deeply and recklessly. It was a love that was never meant for their world. They met in secret. They made plans to run away together, to build a life where his family's money and influence couldn't touch them. Arthur paused, turning from the window to look at Maya. "I was a young footman then. I used to deliver their secret letters. I saw them together. I have never in all my years seen Mr. Davenport as happy as he was in those moments with her. But secrets like that in a house like this have a way of coming to light." His father found out. The ultimatum was swift and brutal. Julian was to end the relationship immediately, or his father would not only disinherit him, but he would use his immense power to destroy Althea to ensure she would never work as a musician, never find peace. He would ruin her life simply to prove a point. Maya listened, her hands clenched around the warm cup the story painting, a picture she could barely comprehend. Mr. Julian was young, Arthur said, a note of profound sadness in his voice. He was afraid. Not for himself, but for her. He believed his father would make good on his threat. So he made a terrible choice. He decided to send her away to protect her. That night, he said, his eyes meeting Maya's was the last time he saw her. He went to her small apartment in the city. He gave her a large sum of money, enough to start a new life anywhere in the world. And he gave her his own watch, the one on your wrist now. It was his most prized possession, a gift from his own grandfather. He told her it was a promise that one day, when he was free of his father, when he had built his own power, he would come and find her. He told her to run, to disappear for her own safety, and to wait for him. He let out a long, slow breath. It was a promise he never kept. He built his empire bigger than his father's ever was. But in doing so, he became a colder, harder man. He tried to find her years later, but she had vanished without a trace. The guilt of that broken promise, it hollowed him out. It turned him into the man you met tonight. The room was silent, save for the rain. The story settled around Maya, heavy and suffocating. She was the daughter of a ghost, the living proof of a broken promise. She looked around the opulent room, then at her own simple uniform, the sheer impossible distance between her life and this one. Does this sort of thing happen often here? She asked, her voice small and dazed, the question nonsensical, a desperate grasp for normalcy in a world turned upside down. Arthur allowed himself the smallest, saddest of smiles. He calmly wiped a smudge of dust from a nearby bookshelf with his handkerchief. Miss, he said, his voice a perfect dry monotone. At Davenport Manor, we typically only face existential crises on Tuesdays. A collapsing wall is a special event arranged just for you. The unexpected wit, so out of place in the tragedy, was like a brief gasp of air. It didn't make anything better, but for a split second, it made the unbearable feel real. It anchored her back to the moment, to the quiet room, to the old man who had just handed her the shattered pieces of her own history. She looked down at the watch. It wasn't just her father's keepsake anymore. It was her mother's last gift. It was Julian Davenport's greatest regret. It was her story. Dawn broke, painting the bruised sky in fragile shades of pink and grey. A profound, unnatural quiet had settled over the island, the kind that only follows immense violence. The air was clean, washed by the storm, but heavy with the scent of saltwater, wet earth, and devastation. Inside the mansion, beams of this new light cut through the dusty gloom, illuminating the full scale of the wreckage. It was a beautiful morning, a cruel irony against the ruin. Maya hadn't slept. She had spent the hours before dawn in the quiet study Arthur had found for her, the butler's story replaying in her mind, each word a piece of a puzzle she never knew she was missing. The story didn't bring peace. It brought a sharper, more defined agony. It gave a face and a name to the ghosts that had haunted her life. Arthur found her there as the sun rose. He carried a small tray with coffee and toast, a gesture of routine in a world that had none left. He didn't have to say anything. The look on his face, a mixture of profound pity and respect, was enough. "Mr. Davenport is awake," he said softly. "He is lucid. He is asking to see you." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. Fear, cold and sharp, warred with a white-hot anger. She had to face him. She had to. She stood up, leaving the untouched breakfast behind, and followed Arthur through the silent, debris-strewn corridors to the main drawing room. Julian was not on the sofa where they had left him. He was sitting in a high-backed armchair near a window that had miraculously survived the storm. He had a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and his arm was in a makeshift sling. In the clear morning light, he looked every bit his age, and more. The power, the arrogance, the cold command. It had all been stripped away by the storm, leaving behind a frail, hollowed-out man. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes, clear, now held the full, unabashed weight of his regret. Maya stopped in the middle of the room, a chasm of ruined carpet and shattered heirlooms separating them. She would not go closer. "Thank you," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp, "for what you did. You saved my life." The words meant nothing to her. They were a social nicety in a situation that had blasted past all forms of civility. Why, she asked, her voice tight a single word, carrying the weight of 19 years of unanswered questions. Julian flinched, as if she had struck him. He looked down at his hands. "There is no good answer to that question," he said quietly. "No excuse that would ever be enough. Try." She shot back the anger she had been suppressing for hours, finally breaking free. "You owe me that much. You owe her that much. Why did you leave her? Was she not good enough for your family, for your name?" "No," he said, looking up, and for the first time, she saw tears glistening in his eyes. "She was too good. She was a shooting star. And I was a man living in a gilded cage. My father, he was a cruel, powerful man. He saw Althea not as a person, but as a complication, a threat to his dynasty. He gave me a choice, the family fortune or the woman I loved. He swore he would destroy her if I chose her. So you chose the money." Maya said the words, dripping with contempt. "No," Julian whispered, shaking his head. "That's the lie I told myself for 30 years. It's the lie that let me sleep at night. I didn't choose the money. I chose fear. I was a coward. I thought I was protecting her by sending her away. I told myself I would build my own world, become more powerful than him. And then I would go back for her. It was the promise of a boy who had no idea how the world worked." "A promise you broke," Maya said, her voice cracking. "Did you even look for her? Or was it just easier to write a check and forget she ever existed?" "Every day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For the first few years I searched. I hired private investigators, but it was as if she had vanished from the face of the earth. I didn't know about you, Maya. I swear to you, I never knew she was pregnant. By the time I had the power to truly defy my father, she was gone, and I let the search grow cold. The work became my escape. The success became my penance. Every deal I closed, every building I built was a monument to my failure to keep the one promise that ever mattered. The raw confession hung in the air between them. It wasn't an excuse. It was a self-damnation." My father, Maya said, her voice trembling as she thought of the kind man in the dusty workshop. The man who raised me. His name was Thomas. He was a carpenter. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. But he was there. He was there for every scraped knee, every nightmare, every birthday. He taught me how to be decent, how to be kind. He loved my mother, and when she got sick after he died, he wasn't there to hold her. Do you have any idea what you destroyed? What your cowardice cost all of us? Each word was an arrow, and Julian let them hit. He didn't deflect. He didn't defend. He simply absorbed her pain, his face, a mask of agony. "Yes," he finally managed to say, "I am beginning to. Seeing you, hearing you speak of him, I see it now. I spent my life building an empire of things, of assets and corporations. That man Thomas, he built a life. He was a better man than I will ever be. He earned the title of your father. I have earned nothing." The admission, so complete and without reservation, didn't erase Maya's anger, but it shifted something inside her. The towering figure of the monster who had abandoned her mother began to shrink, replaced by the pathetic figure of a man trapped in a prison of his own making. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the distant cry of gulls over the now calm sea. The dawn light grew stronger, illuminating the wreckage around them with a clean, unforgiving clarity. The storm was over. The worst of it had passed. But now, in the quiet aftermath, they had to face what was left. They had to decide what if anything could be built from the ruins. The rhythmic chop of helicopter blades was the first sound to pierce the bubble of exhausted silence. It grew from a distant thrum into a powerful percussive beat that vibrated through the damaged floorboards, announcing the arrival of the world they had been cut off from. Within minutes, a team of paramedics and rescue personnel swarmed into the mansion, their movements efficient and professional, their voices calm and authoritative. The surreal, nightmarish isolation was over. Julian was assessed, his injuries stabilized for transport. He submitted to the medic's care with a quiet docility that was utterly foreign to his nature. As they prepared the stretcher, he beckoned Arthur over and whispered a few brief instructions. The butler nodded, retrieved a slim leather folio from a nearby desk, and handed it to Maya. "Mr. Davenport asked me to give you this," Arthur said, his voice retaining its formal dignity. "It contains contact information for his attorneys and the administrators of a trust that has been in your name for many years. All of your grandmother's medical care has been addressed, as has your future education." Maya looked at the expensive folio, a symbol of a life and a power she couldn't comprehend. It felt like a payment, a settlement for a lifetime of absence. The anger she thought had subsided began to prickle at her again. As if reading her mind, Julian spoke his voice, weak but clear. He waved off a paramedic who was trying to adjust his oxygen mask. That he said, nodding toward the folio, is not for you, Maya. It's for me. It is the bare minimum of a responsibility I shirked 30 years ago. It changes nothing. It earns me nothing. It is simply putting the accounts in order. He paused, taking a ragged breath. The medics were readying the stretcher to lift him. Time was running out. "What I want," he said, his eyes locking on hers, stripped of all artifice, all power, leaving only a raw, desperate plea, is something I have no right to ask for. The chance to know you. Not as a father. Thomas earned that title. But as someone who knew your mother, someone who is a part of your story. I will not contact you unless you wish it. The choice is yours and yours alone. You owe me nothing." This was it. The final pivotal moment. The culmination of the storm. The rescue. The revelation. All the power was hers now. The power to accept, to reject, to walk away and leave him to his ghosts. Maya looked down at her wrist, at the cracked face of the watch, its hands forever frozen in time. The entire dizzying story was held in that small, broken object. The love of the man who had given it to her. The pain of the woman who had first received it. The regret of the man who was now asking for a sliver of her grace. She took a slow, deep breath, the clean, post-storm air filling her lungs. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it resonated with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "This watch," she said, holding up her wrist so he could see it clearly, "will never run again. No one can ever fix it. And no one." She said, her gaze firm and unwavering, can ever replace the man who gave it to me. Thomas was my father. That will not change. A flicker of acceptance, of deserved pain, crossed Julian's face. He nodded slowly. But Maya continued the word, hanging in the air, filled with a fragile potential. I think my mother would have wanted me to know the whole story. And I cannot do that without knowing you. She paused. Arthur has my email address. You can write to me, and I will decide if I will write back. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. It was an opening, a crack in the door no wider than the crack on the face of the watch itself. But it was more than he had any right to expect. It was everything. The relief that washed over Julian's face was so profound it seemed to erase years of tension from his features. He couldn't speak. He just nodded again, a single grateful gesture. The medics lifted the stretcher and began carrying him out toward the waiting helicopter. He didn't look back. Perhaps he knew that their fragile truce couldn't bear the weight of a dramatic goodbye. Maya walked to the shattered opening, where the West Wing's great window used to be. She watched as the helicopter lifted off its blades, whipping her hair and clothes. It ascended into the clean, bright sky, a modern machine, leaving a world of old-fashioned pain behind, growing smaller and smaller, until it was just a speck against the vastness of the blue. She stood there for a long time, the sounds of the rescue crew behind her fading into the background. The folio was still in her hand, heavy with the promise of a future free from financial worry. But her eyes were on her other hand, on the wrist that bore the broken watch. She gently traced the jagged crack in the glass with her thumb. It was no longer just a symbol of her father's love or of time standing still. It was now the legacy of a man she was just beginning to know, a testament to a promise that was broken so that she could exist. It was the story of her mother's heart. It was the beginning of hers. And for the first time, she felt ready to carry its weight. A broken watch can never tell time again, but it can tell a story of a promise that was shattered, and of a quiet, steadfast love that endured in its place. Maya's journey reminds us that the past is never truly past. It lives within us in the heirlooms we carry and the secrets we inherit. How many of us walk through life, shaped by choices made by people we never knew, carrying the legacy of a story we are only just beginning to understand. Her path forward isn't about forgiveness as a destination, but about healing as a journey. One that is earned one honest conversation at a time. This story, with its painful and fragile hope, truly moved us. We'd love to know what you think. Let us know in the comments, do you believe Julian truly deserves a chance, or was his regret too little too late? If a single detail like that broken watch resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts. You never know who might need to read your words today. If this story made you think, please leave a like to help it find others. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can join us on the next emotional journey we share together. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is not to erase the past, but to finally decide what its legacy will be.